The late afternoon sun hung low on the horizon, stretching long shadows across the empty road. Kira Mason, seated in her pristine Tesla Model 3, barely noticed the waning light. Her fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the steering wheel as the soft hum of the car's electric motor carried her forward. The cabin was cool and quiet, insulated from the world outside. The faint sound of jazz Miles Davis, soft and lingering, played through the speakers. A perfect complement to the stillness. Kira had always loved this time of day, when the chaos of work and meetings gave way to calm, the noise of life fading into soft edges. It was a small ritual. These drives home, she enjoyed the hum of the road, the satisfaction of progress measured by miles ticking silently on the dashboard. The Tesla itself was a reflection of her, sleek, efficient, and carefully maintained. It represented the kind of life she had worked so hard to build as the founder of a cybersecurity firm. It was a symbol of her success, of arriving. As she rounded a gentle curve, the sudden burst of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror shattered the peace. Kira blinked, her fingers pausing mid-tap. She glanced instinctively at the speedometer, well below the limit. Her brow furrowed. She hadn't missed a stop sign or made any mistake that she could think of. With a sigh, she turned on her signal and eased the car onto the gravel shoulder. The crunch beneath her tires the only sound breaking the silence. Her movements were deliberate, calm, precise. Her father had taught her that. Stay calm, composed. Don't give them any reason to see what they want to see. In the rearview mirror, Kira watched the police car come to a stop behind her. A tall figure emerged. The officer, middle-aged, white, moved with a kind of rigid authority she had seen many times before. There was something practiced about his walk, something deliberate in his pace. She lowered the window as he approached, the sharp scent of dry summer air mixing with the cool of the car's cabin. License and registration. The words weren't a request. His tone was clipped, almost mechanical. The flashlight in his hand flickered across her face, then lingered on the interior. Her bag, her laptop, the sleek dashboard display. Kira's heart thudded, slow and heavy. She reached carefully into the glove compartment and retrieved the documents. Of course, officer, she said evenly, handing them to him. May I ask why I'm being pulled over? The officer didn't answer. He took the papers with barely a glance, his eyes scanning her face before moving to the car again. His flashlight hovered over the laptop bag in the passenger seat, then on the mounted tech around the dashboard. This is quite the setup, he remarked, his voice edged with suspicion. What do you do for a living? Kira's fingers gripped the steering wheel. She smiled faintly, polite. Professional. I run a cybersecurity company. The officer's eyebrows rose slightly, though his expression remained otherwise hard. Cybersecurity, he echoed, skepticism dripping from the word. Yes. Kira's voice stayed steady. I founded Mason Cyber Solutions about 5 years ago. We provide software for businesses to help. Must be doing pretty well if you can afford this. He interrupted, gesturing vaguely toward the car with his flashlight. Kira swallowed the sharp retort rising in her throat. She had heard it before. Words that weren't really about the car or her work but about the assumptions behind them. About who deserved to sit in a car like hers. She kept her tone even. I've worked hard for it. Officer. He stared at her a moment longer, his gaze hard and unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his cruiser, taking her documents with him. Through the side mirror, Kira watched him speak into his radio, his eyes flickering toward her car occasionally. The minutes stretched out, one after another, each passing second thickening the air. Inside the car, Miles Davis played on, the notes soft and smooth, like the sound of a memory you don't want to revisit. Kira exhaled slowly, her knuckles pale against the steering wheel. This wasn't her first time standing in the quiet tension of a moment like this. She knew what it was about, even if no one said the words aloud. No citation was coming. There was no speeding ticket to write. It wasn't about the car or the road. It was about her. The officer returned, his steps slower now, heavier with something unspoken. He leaned down, peering through the window again. Step out of the vehicle. Please. Kira blinked. Excuse me? I said step out of the vehicle. He repeated, His tone clipped. Hard. Now. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her face composed. Officer, I still don't understand. Out of the car, he snapped, hand resting lightly on the belt near his hip. I won't ask again. For a moment, Kira didn't move. The silence stretched between them, her heartbeat filling the space where words should have been. She wanted to argue, to push back, but instead, she did what she had been taught. Stay calm. Don't give them a reason. With deliberate slowness, she unclipped her seatbelt and stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes as she straightened. The officer's eyes swept over her, a glance that was more judgment than curiosity. He began a slow walk around the Tesla, his flashlight tracing over the body of the car, lingering on the details that seemed to offend him most. The clean shine of the paint, the chrome accents, the seamless design. Kira stood quietly, watching him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Is there something specific you're looking for? She asked, her voice calm but firm. The officer didn't answer. He just kept circling, his movements slow, deliberate. After a long moment, he stopped in front of her, his face barely lit by the fading sun. You don't look like the kind of person who drives a car like this, he said, his voice low, almost conversational. Kira felt the words like a blow. Though her face remained still, she forced a tight smile. And what kind of person is that, officer? For the first time, he met her eyes, and there it was. The unspoken thing that had been there all along. A quiet tension crackled between them, the kind of tension that didn't need to be explained or shouted. It was the weight of years, of assumptions, of lives moving in parallel but never really intersecting. The officer didn't answer her question. Instead, he returned to his cruiser, leaving Kira standing alone beside her car. She watched the red and blue lights flash silently against the darkening road, their glow reflecting faintly off the polished hood of the Tesla. In her mind, Kira heard her father's voice again. Stay calm. Don't give them a reason to see what they want to see. But as she stood there, she wondered if it would ever really matter. The officer's radio crackled faintly in the distance as Kira stood by the roadside, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the horizon, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and purple. The hum of the Tesla, so quiet moments ago, was now completely silent, a still machine waiting. Just as she was, Officer Hayes returned, her documents in one hand, her keys in the other. There was no apology, no explanation, only the brusque efficiency of someone accustomed to taking what they wanted without question. Based on protocol, he began, his voice flat, as if rehearsed. This vehicle is being confiscated as part of an ongoing investigation. Kira blinked, the words sounding both surreal and deliberate. Confiscated, she repeated, her tone calm despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. This car is mine. I have the purchase agreement, insurance, everything. Ma'am, Hayes interrupted, holding up a hand. Your continued arguments aren't helping. I suggest you comply and arrange for alternative transportation. Kira felt her fingers curl into fists at her sides. She'd heard about situations like this. The stories shared in hushed tones at family gatherings or passed around in online forums. But hearing about it was different from standing in the middle of it, her car keys dangling from someone else's hand as if they no longer belonged to her. This is unreasonable, she said, her voice steady but firm. You've yet to tell me why I was stopped in the first place, let alone why you're taking my car. Hayes gave a faint shrug, his expression unreadable. Sometimes things don't add up, he said vaguely, slipping the keys into his pocket. We'll be in touch once the investigation is complete. The words were cold, clinical, leaving no room for rebuttal. Kira could feel the tight knot in her chest growing, her breaths shallow but measured. Don't escalate. Don't give him an excuse. And how? She asked, her voice quiet but sharp. Am I supposed to get home? You're leaving me on an empty road with no transportation, no justification, and no explanation. Hayes paused, as if considering her question, though the answer seemed to matter little to him. You'll figure it out, he said simply, before turning on his heel and heading toward her car. Kira watched in stunned silence as he opened the driver's side door and adjusted the seat to fit his larger frame. The Tesla, Her Tesla hummed back to life under his touch. The sound was almost mocking. A reminder of how easily something she had worked for could be taken away. Her voice cracked as she called after him. This isn't right. Officer Hayes. You know this isn't right. He didn't look at her. Didn't acknowledge her words. Instead, he closed the door, the tinted glass creating an impenetrable barrier between them. The red tail lights flared as he pulled back onto the road. Her car disappearing into the fading light. His cruiser followed close behind, leaving her standing alone, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the countryside. The gravel beneath her feet felt unsteady. Though it hadn't moved, her chest heaved as she fought back tears. Not of sadness, but of frustration, of indignation. She had done everything right. She had followed every rule, provided every document, maintained her composure, and yet, none of it had mattered. In the silence that followed, Kira felt the weight of every story she had ever heard about moments like this. She thought of her father, who had taught her how to stay calm in the face of injustice. And of her mother, who had always insisted on the importance of standing up for herself. Their advice, seemingly at odds, swirled in her mind like an unresolved chord. The Tesla was more than a car. It was her independence, her success, her identity in a world that too often questioned her right to have any of those things. And now, it was gone. Not because of anything she had done, but because of what she represented to someone else. Kira reached for her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she scrolled through her contacts. The urge to call someone to share what had just happened was strong. But she hesitated. What would she say? How would she explain what couldn't fully be put into words? The world around her grew darker, the shadows stretching across the road as night settled in. A faint chill crept into the air, wrapping around her like a warning. She slipped her phone into her pocket, her mind already shifting from the immediate shock to the questions she would demand answers to in the coming days. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Kira took one last look at the empty stretch of road where her car had been. Then started walking, her steps deliberate and resolute. The sound of gravel crunching beneath her shoes was the only noise in the stillness. A quiet rhythm to match the steady beat of her anger. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: the fight was just beginning. The next morning, sunlight streamed through Kira's modest home office, highlighting the organized chaos of her workspace. Stacks of papers, unopened mail, and a half-empty mug of cold coffee occupied the desk. On the screen in front of her, the Tesla app displayed a chilling confirmation. The car was still in motion the previous night. Its location now static at a police impound lot downtown. Kira stared at the map, her jaw tight. There it was. Her car. Her property confiscated without explanation. She wanted to feel relieved that it hadn't disappeared completely, but the fact that it had been taken at all weighed heavily on her. The pristine lines of the Tesla on the app's interface only served to remind her of the hours spent researching and saving for it. Of what it represented: freedom, innovation, and security. She closed the app and leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about the car. It never was. The memories of the stop replayed in her mind, vivid and unshakable. The officer's tone, his casual dismissal of her documents, the weight of his suspicion. It wasn't the first time Kira had felt the subtle but unmistakable shadow of judgment cast over her. But it was the most overt. The calm facade she'd held during the stop now felt like a dam holding back a flood of indignation. She pulled up her email, composing a message to her attorney. The subject line was simple: unlawful traffic stop and vehicle confiscation. As she typed, each word felt deliberate, an assertion of control in a situation designed to strip her of it. She attached the receipts, insurance information, and Tesla purchase agreement, every piece of evidence proving her ownership. Just as she hit send, her phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed an unknown number, but Kira answered anyway, her voice steady. Hello? Kira Mason? The voice on the other end was male, low, and professional. Yes. Who's calling? This is Lieutenant Brandon Parker from the City Police Department. I believe you're the registered owner of a Tesla Model 3? Kira felt her heartbeat quicken. I am. What's this about? There was a brief pause. I'd like to schedule a time for you to come down to the precinct to discuss an ongoing investigation. It involves your vehicle. Her fingers tightened around the phone. The audacity of it all. As if she were the one under suspicion. She forced herself to respond calmly. Lieutenant, my vehicle was unlawfully seized yesterday. I'm more than happy to cooperate. But I'd like to understand why it was taken in the first place. There was another pause. Longer this time. The officer on duty flagged the car for potential involvement in a larger case. I can't share specifics over the phone. But if you come in, we can clear up any misunderstandings. The explanation was vague, evasive. Kira knew better than to expect transparency. But the lack of accountability stung nonetheless. I'll be there, she said evenly, taking note of the time and location he provided before ending the call. The precinct was a nondescript building. Its gray facade blending into the city's backdrop. As Kira entered, the hum of activity surrounded her, phones ringing, officers typing reports, voices overlapping in a constant drone. She approached the front desk, where a young officer greeted her with a polite but indifferent smile. I have an appointment with Lieutenant Parker, she said, keeping her voice measured. After a brief call to his office, the officer directed her down a hallway. The room she was led to was small, its plain walls adorned with outdated calendars and a bulletin board covered in notices. Lieutenant Parker sat behind a desk cluttered with files, his expression unreadable. Ms. Mason, he said, standing and extending a hand. Thank you for coming in. Kira shook his hand, her grip firm. Let's get to it, she said, sitting down. Parker didn't waste time. Your vehicle was flagged during a routine patrol yesterday. He began, his tone neutral. The officer reported it as part of a broader investigation into stolen property and fraud. Kira's lips tightened. Stolen property? She repeated. Officer Hayes took my car without cause. I provided all the documentation proving it was mine. I understand your frustration, Parker said, his tone carefully placating. However, the department has protocols in place to address situations where vehicles may be linked to criminal activity. It's not personal. Not personal. The phrase echoed in her mind. Hollow and dismissive. Kira straightened in her seat, meeting his gaze. Lieutenant, this wasn't a routine stop. This was an officer making an assumption based on how I look. Not on any evidence. Do you know how that feels? For the first time, Parker hesitated, his professional mask slipping ever so slightly. I can't speak to Officer Hayes's intent, he said carefully, but I assure you, we take any allegations of misconduct seriously. Kira studied him, noting the slight tension in his jaw. She had heard these lines before, polished and rehearsed, but Parker didn't strike her as disingenuous. At least, not entirely. I'll be filing a formal complaint, she said, her voice firm but calm. And I expect my car returned immediately. There's no reason for it to remain impounded. Parker nodded slowly. I'll expedite the process. You should have your car back by the end of the week. It wasn't the immediate resolution she wanted, but it was a start. As she stood to leave, Parker's voice stopped her. Ms. Mason, he said, leaning forward slightly, you're not wrong to question what happened. But be careful how you proceed. These situations can get complicated. Kira turned back to him, her expression steady. Complicated for whom, Lieutenant? He didn't answer, but the flicker of discomfort in his eyes said enough. As Kira walked back to her car, a rideshare she'd reluctantly booked for the trip. Her mind churned. Parker's words lingered, a vague warning that did little to deter her. She knew this fight wasn't just about her Tesla or the stop itself. It was about a system that allowed these moments to happen over and over again. Each time eroding the trust it claimed to protect. Settling into the back seat of the car, Kira stared out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. She thought of her parents, of the stories they used to tell about navigating a world where they were always second-guessed. Always questioned. The tools she had, the education, the resources, the connections, didn't shield her from that reality. They only made the injustice more glaring. As the car moved through the city streets, Kira made a silent vow. This wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until the questions that had haunted her yesterday, today, and every day before were finally answered. The following days passed with a sense of uneasy anticipation. Kira went about her daily routine. But the interruption in her life was like a thread pulled loose from a carefully woven fabric. The small rip grew more apparent with every moment she thought about the events on that quiet stretch of road. Her Tesla, the car she'd worked so hard to buy, still sat in the impound lot. Despite Lieutenant Parker's promise to expedite its return, the days had stretched longer than they should. Each call she made to follow up was met with polite deflection. "We're processing the paperwork," the voices on the other end of the line would say, their tone clipped, dispassionate. It wasn't about the car anymore. Not entirely. It was about principle, about fairness, about that gnawing question: why had this happened to her? On the fourth day, Kira finally received a call from the precinct. She answered on the first ring. "Ms. Mason, this is Lieutenant Parker. Your car is ready for release. You can pick it up anytime today." The relief she felt was fleeting. What about the officer who impounded it? Have you investigated his actions? There was a pause, long enough for Kira to imagine Parker choosing his words carefully. "We're handling it internally," he said finally, "but I encourage you to file your formal complaint if you haven't already." She had filed it. She'd sent copies of it to the precinct's oversight committee and the city's civilian review board. But Parker's response made it clear: whatever accountability existed, it wouldn't start with the department. The impound lot was a bleak expanse of concrete and chain-link fences. Rows of cars, each marked with faded chalk numbers, sat in silent testimony to their owners' frustrations. Kira arrived in a rideshare, her jaw set and her focus sharp. The attendant behind the glass window barely looked up when she handed over the paperwork. "Tesla Model 3, she said, her voice steady. "Lot 14, the man mumbled, sliding a key across the counter. Walking toward the car felt strange, like reclaiming something that had been wrested away from her. The Tesla gleamed under the afternoon sun. But as she got closer, she noticed smudges on the windows and fingerprints on the doors. The sight made her chest tighten. This was more than a car to her, it was a part of her identity. A symbol of everything she'd worked for. Seeing it treated with such disregard felt like a personal insult. Sliding into the driver's seat, she took a deep breath and pressed the start button. The familiar hum of the engine soothed her nerves. But something felt off. She noticed the passenger seat had been pushed back, far more than she would have adjusted it. The center console's storage bin was slightly ajar, as though someone had rifled through it. Her pulse quickened. She tapped the car's touchscreen, navigating to the system's security log. Sure enough, there were entries for times and dates she didn't recognize, entries that showed the car had been accessed while in police custody. Kira's hands hovered over the screen, her mind racing. What had they been looking for? What had they done? That evening, she sat at her desk, reviewing the logs in more detail. The Tesla's built-in cameras had captured brief snippets of activity figures moving around the car. A flashlight sweeping across the dashboard. None of the faces were visible, but the footage filled her with unease. She called her attorney, explaining everything in a calm but firm tone. The lawyer, a woman named Ellen Kim, listened carefully before responding. "This is troubling," Ellen said. "We'll add this to the complaint. But I want you to consider something. They might retaliate." Kira frowned. "Retaliate? For what?" "For pushing back," Ellen said. "You're challenging their actions, and that's not something people in power take lightly." Kira sat in silence for a moment, weighing the warning. "I'm not backing down," she said finally. "I have to see this through." Ellen sighed. "Then be careful. Watch your back." The next morning, Kira received a letter in the mail. A crisp envelope stamped with the logo of the city's police department. Inside was an official notice informing her that the investigation into her complaint was ongoing, and that no further details could be provided at this time. The language was sterile, detached, and impersonal. An attempt, it seemed, to discourage her. But instead of discouragement, Kira felt something else: resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been treated like their rights were negotiable. For every moment of indignity that had gone unanswered. She thought of her parents, who had endured their own struggles. Her father, who had taught her the value of persistence. Her mother, who had always reminded her to stand tall. Even when the world tried to shrink her, they wouldn't have wanted her to walk away from this. Later that evening, as the city's lights flickered to life, Kira sat in her Tesla, parked at the edge of a quiet overlook. The skyline stretched before her, a maze of possibilities and challenges. She replayed the footage from the car's cameras, watching the shadowy figures moving around her vehicle. Her mind was clear now, her purpose solidifying with every passing moment. This wasn't just a story about a car. It was a story about accountability, about refusing to be silenced. And no matter how long it took, Kira knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't stop until the truth came to light. The days following her discovery passed quietly but with a growing sense of unease. Kira's life resumed its normal rhythms: meetings at her cybersecurity firm, evenings spent catching up on emails and tinkering with prototypes. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a faint shadow trailing her every move. She first noticed it in small, almost imperceptible ways. A patrol car parked outside her office, its officers seemingly uninterested in her but lingering just long enough to make their presence known. A black sedan idling across the street from her apartment at odd hours. She told herself it was paranoia, a symptom of her heightened awareness after the incident. But the details were too consistent to ignore. One evening, as she sat at her desk reviewing client proposals, her phone buzzed with a text from Ellen, her attorney. The message was brief but unsettling. "We need to meet. There's been a development." When they met the next morning at a quiet cafe downtown, Ellen's expression was more serious than Kira had ever seen. She slid a folder across the table, her manicured nails tapping it lightly. "This came to my office yesterday," Ellen said. "Anonymous delivery. I think it's meant to intimidate you." Inside the folder were grainy photos of Kira leaving her office, walking to her car, entering her apartment building. They were candid, taken from a distance, but unmistakably her. Accompanying the photos was a single sheet of paper with the words, "Drop the complaint. It's not worth it." Kira's stomach tightened as she stared at the photos. She took a deep breath, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "What do they think this will accomplish? I'm not going to back down." Ellen studied her for a moment, her brow furrowed. "Kira, you need to be careful. Whoever sent this knows your routines. They're watching you." "I know," Kira said softly, "but this isn't just about me anymore. If I give up, they'll think they can do this to anyone." Ellen reached across the table, her tone more personal now. "I admire your courage, but don't let pride blind you to the risks. These people, they play dirty." That evening, Kira doubled down on her own precautions. She updated her home security system, installed additional surveillance cameras in her apartment, and even set up motion sensors around her office. Her expertise in cybersecurity now extended to her physical safety, her systems meticulously designed to alert her to any unusual activity. But it wasn't just fear driving her. It was something deeper. An understanding of how power worked in subtle, insidious ways. The people behind these actions weren't just trying to silence her, they were testing her resolve, pushing her to see how far she'd go before she folded. And if she folded, what message would that send to others who faced similar injustices? A week later, Kira received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Ms. Mason?" a male voice asked. It was low, deliberate, and unfamiliar. "Yes. Who is this?" "This is Officer Hayes. I need to talk to you." Kira's grip on the phone tightened. She recognized the name. Hayes was the officer who had confiscated her car. She hadn't seen him since that day, though his actions had remained a focal point of her complaint. "What could we possibly have to talk about?" she asked. Her voice measured. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a weight she didn't expect. "I need to explain some things. Not over the phone. Can we meet?" Kira's instinct was to say no, to end the call and block the number. But something about his voice gave her pause a note of unease, almost regret. She glanced at the clock, weighing the risks. "Fine," she said finally. "Tomorrow, noon, public place." They met at a small diner on the outskirts of the city, a place Kira chose for its visibility and steady stream of patrons. Hayes was already seated when she arrived, His uniform replaced by a plain button-down shirt and jeans. He looked different, smaller. Somehow, his eyes darted around the room. And he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Kira slid into the booth across from him. Her expression neutral. You wanted to talk, so talk. Hayes sighed, running a hand through his hair. First, I need to say, I'm sorry, for everything. Kira raised an eyebrow, her skepticism clear. Sorry for what? Exactly? For targeting me? For stealing my car? For violating my rights? All of it, he said, his voice quieter now. I wasn't acting on my own that day. I was following orders. Orders? Kira's tone was sharp. From who? Hayes hesitated, glancing around the diner before leaning in. There's a system in place. Certain people get flagged. Certain cars. I didn't ask questions. I just did what I was told. Kira's stomach turned, but she kept her expression steady. And why are you telling me this now? Because I've been doing some digging. Hayes said, his voice low. And I realized, this isn't just about you. It's bigger than you or me. There's a whole network behind this. People in high places. For the first time, Kira saw something in his eyes that felt genuine, a mix of fear and guilt. She didn't trust him yet. But she couldn't ignore the potential value of what he was offering. If you're serious about making this right, she said, her voice firm, then you need to prove it. Names. Evidence. Otherwise, this is just words. Hayes nodded, his jaw tightening. I'll get you what you need. Just, be careful. They're watching me too. That night, as Kira reviewed the day's events, she felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The unseen currents she had sensed were becoming clearer, revealing a network of corruption that ran deeper than she had imagined. But for the first time, she also felt something else, a glimmer of possibility. If Hayes was telling the truth, if he could provide the evidence she needed, then maybe, just maybe, she could turn this tide. The thought steadied her as she sat at her desk, the soft hum of her computer filling the room. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet battles unfolding in its shadows. But Kira was ready. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. The cafe where they agreed to meet was small and unassuming, tucked into a quiet neighborhood far from the sterile halls of downtown or the bustling coffee chains. Kira chose it deliberately, a place where the hum of conversation and the clinking of porcelain cups would mask anything too conspicuous. She arrived early, selecting a table by the window where she could see both the door and the street outside. When Hayes entered, he looked different from the last time they met. His posture was less rigid, his face lined with weariness rather than authority. He nodded in her direction and made his way to the table, carrying a weathered messenger bag slung over one shoulder. You're late, Kira said as he sat down, her tone cool but not hostile. Sorry, he replied, setting the bag on the table. Had to be careful. The pause that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken tension of two people on opposite sides of a chasm that neither was sure could be bridged. Finally, Kira broke the silence. What do you have for me? Hayes reached into the bag, pulling out a thin folder and a flash drive. He slid them across the table, his movements deliberate but tinged with hesitation. This is everything I could get my hands on. Records, names, transactions. It's not everything, but it's a start. Kira opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents quickly but thoroughly. There were internal memos, reports with conspicuous omissions, and a list of names that made her stomach tighten. She glanced up at Hayes, her expression unreadable. You understand what this means, right? She said. Once this gets out, there's no going back. He nodded, his jaw tight. I know. That's why I came to you. For the first time, Hayes seemed more than a reluctant participant. As they spoke, he described the network of corruption that had slowly ensnared him over the years. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, he explained, just small decisions that grew into habits, compromises that became routine. It wasn't like I woke up one day and decided to be part of this. He said, his voice low. It's subtle. You tell yourself it's just this one time. Just this one favor. Then, before you know it, you're in too deep. Kira listened, her expression carefully neutral. She wasn't ready to absolve him. Not yet. But there was something disarming about his honesty. It reminded her of the quiet ways prejudice and power intertwined. The unspoken rules that shaped who was allowed to succeed and who was marked as suspicious. "Why now?" she asked. "Why risk everything to help me?" Hayes looked down at his hands, his fingers absently tracing the edge of the table. "Because I can't keep looking the other way. Not after what happened to you. And, not after what I've done." His voice broke slightly on the last word. And Kira caught a glimpse of the weight he carried. Not just guilt, but something deeper. Shame. Perhaps. Regret. As the conversation unfolded, Kira began to see Hayes not as the man who had wronged her, but as a symbol of something larger. He was both a perpetrator and a victim of the system they were now trying to dismantle. His story was a mirror of her own, in some ways a life shaped by unseen forces. A constant negotiation of power and identity. But where Kira had learned to navigate those forces with precision, Hayes had become ensnared by them. And now, he was trying to claw his way out. "Do you think this will change anything?" Hayes asked, his voice quiet but steady. "It has to," Kira replied. "If it doesn't, then what's the point?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the faint sound of a car door closing broke the silence, followed by the muted hum of traffic. The world moved on, oblivious to the small act of defiance taking place in that cafe. When Hayes left, Kira sat alone for a while, the folder and flash drive resting on the table in front of her. She felt the weight of what they represented. The stories buried in those documents. The lives affected by decisions made behind closed doors. She thought of her brother, of the years he had lost, and of the quiet strength he still carried despite everything. She thought of the people whose names she didn't know, people who had faced similar injustices but never had the chance to fight back. And she thought of Hayes, a man caught in the currents of a system that rewarded complicity and punished dissent. He wasn't a hero, but he wasn't a villain either. He was something in between, a reminder that change rarely came from perfect people, but from flawed ones making imperfect choices. That night, back in her apartment, Kira began to piece together the story the documents told. Each name, each transaction, was a thread in a larger web of corruption that stretched farther than she had anticipated. The scale of it was daunting, but it also clarified her purpose. This wasn't just about her car, or even about Hayes. It was about exposing the quiet, insidious ways power operated. The subtle decisions that determined who was protected and who was left vulnerable. As she worked late into the night, the glow of her computer screen illuminating the room, Kira felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in weeks. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she wasn't walking it alone. The quiet of the early morning settled over the city as Kira sipped her coffee, staring at the stack of papers spread across her dining table. The documents Hayes had provided were damning, their contents enough to disrupt lives, careers, and entire networks of influence. Yet, as powerful as the evidence was, it also felt fragile, paper thin against the deeply rooted system it sought to expose. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a muted orange glow through the blinds. Kira's apartment was still, save for the occasional hum of her laptop or the soft rustle of paper as she turned a page. She had spent the night sorting through the information, cross-referencing it with her own research, and building a narrative that could withstand scrutiny. But the question lingered: would it be enough? Later that day, she met Hayes at a secluded park, the kind of place where conversations were shielded by the sound of rustling leaves and the chatter of birds. Hayes arrived looking worn but resolved, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket as he approached her bench. "Any progress?" he asked. Sitting beside her, Kira handed him a small folder, her expression calm but serious. "These are the key players. Their connections, their transactions, everything we could trace so far." Hayes flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he read. "Some of these names," he trailed off, his voice heavy with recognition. "They're powerful," Kira said, her tone measured, "and they've been operating unchecked for years. But this isn't just about their power. It's about the people they've hurt, the lives they've upended." Hayes nodded, but his expression darkened. "You know what happens when you go after people like this, right? They don't just sit back and let it happen. They'll fight hard." I know, Kira replied, her voice steady, but that doesn't mean we stop. Their conversation shifted to strategy. Hayes had spent the past few days quietly reaching out to trusted contacts within the force, gauging who might be willing to support their efforts. Some had been receptive, while others had responded with skepticism or outright hostility. It's not just fear, Hayes explained, leaning forward on the bench. It's loyalty, twisted, maybe, but real. They've built their careers under these people, benefited from the system. Turning on them feels like betrayal. Kira considered his words, her gaze focused on a distant tree swaying in the breeze. And what about you? How do you reconcile that? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at his hands, as if the answer might be written in the lines of his palms. I don't know, he said finally. I guess I just decided the cost of staying silent was higher than the cost of speaking up. That evening, Kira found herself revisiting her own motivations. Her brother's face flashed in her mind. The quiet strength in his eyes. The way he had always believed in doing what was right, even when it cost him. She thought of the moments when she had doubted her own resilience, when the weight of fighting felt too heavy to bear. But then she thought of the people who had reached out to her since the incident. The emails and messages from strangers who shared their own stories of injustice, their own moments of being made to feel small. Their words reminded her that this wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or diminished. The following day, Kira and Hayes met with Ellen, Kira's attorney, to discuss their next steps. Ellen had been skeptical of involving Hayes at first, but as they laid out their findings, her skepticism gave way to cautious optimism. This is compelling, Ellen said, tapping the stack of documents on the table. But we need to be strategic about how we use it. If we go public too soon, they'll have time to bury it, or worse, come after you. Kira nodded. So what do you suggest? We build a coalition, Ellen replied. Journalists, advocacy groups, even whistleblowers from inside the system. We make it impossible for them to ignore the evidence. Hayes leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. And what happens when they push back? Because they will. Ellen's gaze didn't waver. Then we push harder. But we do it smart. We don't give them the chance to discredit us. As the days passed, the plan began to take shape. Kira worked tirelessly to organize the evidence into a coherent narrative, while Hayes continued to reach out to allies, carefully navigating the minefield of trust and betrayal within the precinct. Ellen reached out to her network, discreetly connecting them with investigative journalists and legal experts who could lend their support. It was slow, meticulous work, the kind that required patience and an unwavering focus on the goal. Yet, beneath the surface, the tension simmered. Kira felt it in the way Hayes avoided eye contact when certain names came up, in the guarded tone of his voice when he spoke about his colleagues. Do you trust them? Kira asked one evening as they reviewed their progress. Hayes hesitated, his jaw tightening. I want to, but trust doesn't come easy in a system like this. Kira nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Then we focus on what we can control. The truth. The day they decided to go public, the air felt heavy with anticipation. They had coordinated a meeting with a group of journalists, carefully selecting those known for their integrity and commitment to exposing corruption. Kira felt the familiar surge of nerves as she prepared to share her story. But it was tempered by a quiet resolve. This is it, Hayes said as they stood outside the building, the folder of evidence in his hand. No turning back now. Kira looked at him, her expression calm but firm. There was never any turning back. As they stepped inside, the weight of their choices settled over them, a reminder of the quiet, persistent courage it took to confront a system built to resist change. And yet, in that moment, Kira felt something else, too. Hope. A flicker of possibility that, even in the face of power and prejudice, the truth could still find its way forward. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of a laptop as Kira clicked through the final files. The evidence was no longer just a collection of data, it was a story of power, corruption, and resilience, the kind of story that exposed not just individuals but an entire system. And the way it quietly reinforced the inequalities woven into everyday life. Hayes sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze fixed on the table. The past weeks had transformed him in ways he hadn't expected. What started as a desperate bid to save himself had become something more, a search for redemption that had brought him face to face with truths he could no longer ignore. "It's ready," Kira said, her voice steady but subdued. She leaned back, glancing at Hayes. "Once this goes live, it's out of our hands." Hayes nodded, exhaling slowly. "Do you think it will be enough?" "It has to be," Kira replied, but her tone, though calm, carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. She knew the forces they were up against, powerful people who had spent years fortifying their positions, creating barriers to accountability. What they had uncovered was a crack in the foundation. But it would take more than one story to bring the structure down. The press conference was scheduled for late afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city as Kira and Hayes arrived at the venue. The room was packed with journalists, their cameras and notepads at the ready. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind of quiet tension that often preceded something important. Kira stood at the podium, her fingers gripping its edges as she surveyed the room. Behind her, a screen displayed excerpts from the evidence, emails, transaction records, surveillance footage. Each piece is a small but vital part of the larger puzzle. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice calm but firm. "My name is Kira Mason, and today we're here to tell a story about how systems meant to protect us can sometimes do the opposite. And how, when faced with injustice, ordinary people can make extraordinary choices to fight back." Hayes stood off to the side, watching as Kira outlined the findings. She spoke with a quiet authority, her words measured and deliberate. There was no sensationalism, no theatrics, only the steady, undeniable weight of the truth. The questions from the press came quickly, some probing and others skeptical. Hayes fielded a few of them, his answers short and direct. When asked why he had decided to come forward, he paused for a moment before replying. "Because I was part of the problem," he said, his voice steady. "For years, I turned a blind eye, made excuses, told myself it wasn't my responsibility. But it was. It is. And if we want things to change, it starts with accountability, including my own." His words hung in the air, met with a silence that felt heavier than applause. Kira watched him, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, respect, perhaps, or gratitude. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly. News outlets picked up the coverage, amplifying it across the country. Social media buzzed with reactions, from outrage to disbelief to cautious hope. Protests sprang up in front of government buildings, and calls for reform grew louder. But with the attention came the pushback. Anonymous threats appeared in Kira's inbox. Hayes noticed unmarked cars parked near his home, their occupants watching but never approaching. The weight of their actions pressed down on them, a constant reminder of the risks they had taken. "You knew this would happen," Hayes said one evening as they reviewed the latest developments. "Didn't you?" Kira nodded, her expression calm. "Of course. But that doesn't make it any easier." "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice low. She looked at him, her gaze steady. "No. Do you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "No," he said finally. "I don't. But I wish it didn't have to be this way." The backlash, though intense, couldn't overshadow the impact of their work. Investigations were launched, arrests were made, and policies were revisited. The system didn't crumble overnight. It rarely did. But cracks began to show. And in those cracks, there was room for something new to take root. For Kira, the fight wasn't over. She knew this was just the beginning, a single step in a much longer journey. But as she stood in her office one evening, looking out at the city, she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. They had done something real, something that mattered. Hayes joined her at the window, his hands in his pockets. "You think they'll listen?" he asked, nodding toward the city below. "They're listening," Kira replied. "Whether they'll act, that's up to them. But we've done our part." "And what about us?" Hayes asked, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "What's next?" Kira turned to him, her expression softening. "We keep going. There's always more work to do. That night, as Kira sat at her desk, reviewing the next steps in their plan, she thought of her brother. She thought of the years he had lost, the strength he had shown, and the quiet resilience that had inspired her own. This fight was for him. But it was also for everyone who had ever felt invisible, dismissed, or powerless. The road ahead was uncertain. But Kira knew one thing. It was a road worth traveling. And she wasn't traveling it alone.